Hi, my name is Tessa Cox, and this is my Problem of Practice defense presentation for the Baylor University Learning and Organizational Change Online Doctorate of Education program. The title of my Problem of Practice is Breaking Fake News, Attempting to Mitigate the Spread of False Information Through Media Literacy Education in Adolescents Using the Inoculation Theory. My problem statement: although most people in the United States access information through the internet, many scholars and educators express an increasing concern regarding the ability to analyze and evaluate that information accurately and effectively, which leads to widespread false information. In reviewing the literature regarding this topic, there is a history of false information causing problems, including election interference and the deterioration of democracy, public health issues, and issues with education such as book bans and censorship. There are multiple theories that lend explanation to why false information spreads, but it all boils down to the idea that we have a tendency to believe information. The more that we see it, we gravitate towards people that believe the same things that we do and are similar to us, which leads to echo chambers. And these echo chambers are exacerbated by confirmation bias, in which we seek out information that agrees with what we already think, and algorithms that serve to keep users engaged on online platforms. This leads to higher level of self-efficacy and higher confidence that we are certain of the information that we know, and a lower likelihood to be open to ideas that contradict what we think. Some other theories that lend explanation to how our minds process media and therefore are apt to believe false information. Message interpretation process theory posits that we interpret messages through media both cognitively and affectively, meaning emotionally, and our emotions tend to have a stronger reaction than our cognitive faculties. Dual process theory poses that we consume media actively or passively, meaning we can process media actively and reflectively and critically, or passively, that we do not think of it and we are reflexive about it instead of reflective. And the theory of visual persuasion is the idea that we are more easily persuaded by visuals because visuals historically have been more difficult to manipulate, although that is becoming less so with time and technological advancements. Abilities such as procedural news knowledge and digital literacy and civic online reasoning increase our resistance to persuasive techniques and false information, and therefore reduce our likelihood of believing in false information. The purpose of this mixed methods intervention study is to evaluate the effectiveness of a media literacy education program and its influence on high school students' media habits. My research questions. My quantitative question was, is there a statistically significant difference in high school students' belief in false information before and after participating in a media literacy education program? My qualitative question was, how does media literacy education in a high school elective media course influence adolescents' media habits? And my mixed methods question asked, to what extent do the results from the qualitative data regarding student media habits and the quantitative data on the students' belief in false information converge? For my theoretical framework, I used the inoculation theory, or the communication theory of inoculation, originated from William McGuire in the 1960s. He took the idea of biological inoculation or vaccines and applied it to the concept of persuasion by confirming that if introduced to weakened versions of either counter-arguments or persuasive techniques, the mind then builds more robust defenses against those counter-arguments and persuasive techniques. Basically, what he found was, similarly to how we introduce the body to a weakened version of a virus, if the mind is introduced to weakened versions of persuasive techniques or counter-arguments to what we believe, we are more likely to build defenses against those persuasive techniques or counter-arguments. Whereas if those beliefs continue to go uncontested, they are increasingly vulnerable to persuasive techniques and counter-arguments. I use this as my theoretical framework because the ultimate goal of media literacy education is to inform students of the techniques used in media that are used often to persuade them and sometimes persuade them towards false information. So therefore, using the inoculation theory made sense in measuring the influence of a media literacy education program intervention in this study. My methodology was a mixed methods intervention study using the 15-week media literacy education program as the intervention in the study. Before starting the media literacy education program, I first gave a qualitative focus group interview, and immediately after that, I gave the adolescent conspiracy belief questionnaire, and I ended up with 13 participants for that. We then went through the 15-week program, and this program included elements from the media literacy crash course on YouTube, the Checkology platform created by the News Literacy Project, the Civic Online Reasoning course produced by the Stanford History Education Group, and all of these built into the project-based learning product that was scaffolded throughout the entire program. All of these led to collecting qualitative data through weekly reflection questions and their weekly media literacy assignments. After the end of the program, I then administered the ACBQ again and then gave a second focus group interview to 5 of the 6 original participants, asking the same questions as in the initial focus group, in addition to adding a few follow-up questions to more accurately gauge the influence of the program. I then analyzed both the quantitative data and then the qualitative data and interpreted and integrated those findings in order to reflect the influence of the program. For my quantitative analysis, I used the Wilcoxon-signed rank non-parametric test that measures the difference in means from the pre-test to the post-test. The higher the score on the ACBQ, the higher the level of the belief in conspiracy theories. So what we were looking for was a reduction in those means and saw that. The pre-test mean was 45.4 and the post-test mean was 42.6. However, the standard deviation went from 7 in the pre-test to 10.9 in the post-test, and this is likely because there were 2 extreme outliers and 1 outlier in the post-test data, and with only 13 participants, this led to a lack of statistical significance in the results. So this led to me failing to reject the null hypothesis. For my qualitative findings, my first round of coding, I coded their responses in the reflection questions and the focus groups based on interest, perception, skepticism, and trust, which fell into the category of media perceptions, and money and advertising, bias, filter bubble, and media influence and purpose, which fell into the category of media understanding. Both media perceptions and media understanding ultimately led to changes in their media habits, and it was their media habits that I ultimately applied the theoretical framework to in order to determine how the media literacy education program influenced their habits. So in applying McGuire's theoretical framework to their media habits, I had to break them down into habits that led them to be vulnerable to persuasive attacks or resistant to persuasive attacks. So the habits that indicated that they were vulnerable to persuasive attacks included low interest in verifying the truthfulness of information and primarily consuming media content through streaming and social media outlets such as YouTube, Instagram, and TikTok, because these lack the traditional gatekeeping function that exists in traditional media and traditional news outlets. So this led to the thematic statement that media habits of adolescents leave them vulnerable to persuasive attacks and false information. Additionally, the codes that indicated that their defenses were stimulated and therefore they were resistant to persuasive attacks included mentions of verification habits, meaning verifying the truth of information that they encounter, false information and therefore detecting false information and being aware that there is false information in the media, and lateral reading is the concept brought forth by the Civic Online Reasoning course that teaches them to investigate who is behind the information, what do other sources say about the information, and what is the evidence to support the information. So mentions of any of these 3 concepts indicated that they were resistant to persuasive attacks, which led to the second thematic statement: recognition of false information, verification habits, and specifically lateral reading indicate resistance to persuasive attacks and false information. In converging the quantitative and qualitative data, it did not necessarily agree with each other. This is my first table showing my integrated findings combining the quantitative and qualitative findings, and it is by individual participant. Negative numbers under change from pre to post on ACBQ indicate their scores going down and a lowered belief in false information, while positive numbers indicate an increase in their score, therefore their belief going up. Their frequency of habit and understanding codes indicates how many codes are present in their responses to the qualitative reflection questions. Next is direct quotes from the participants that include responses indicating resistance to false information or persuasive techniques in media. And then finally, this shows whether that data is convergent or divergent. If their score went down and they included information that indicates resistance, then their data was convergent. However, if there was no change or if there was positive change in their ACBQ score, but they still gave responses that indicated resistance to false information. They're labeled as divergent. So there were 7 participants labeled as convergent. Their scores went down and they gave responses indicating resistance to false information, while there were 6 whose scores went up, but they also gave qualitative responses indicating resistance to false information. One of the explanations for this is that the ACBQ was directly measuring their belief in conspiracy theories and the change in that belief in just a mere 15 weeks, while the qualitative data collection included more nuanced responses that indicated resistance to persuasive techniques. The second table of integrated findings includes those changes in ACBQ scores again, but alongside quotes that indicate vulnerabilities at any point in the program, the timing of those vulnerable quotes next to quotes that indicate resistance, and the timing of those resistance quotes. The quotes that indicate vulnerability include primarily using platforms like YouTube, Instagram, and TikTok for their media consumption, as those are streaming and social media services that lack gatekeeping functions of traditional media, a lack of interest in verifying the truthfulness of facts, and simply not knowing. 3 of the vulnerable quotes come from Final Reflection. Most of the quotes that indicate vulnerability came from earlier in the program. Several of them came from the first focus group or earlier weeks in the weekly reflection questions. And while 3 of them did come from the final reflection, those participants also gave responses that indicate resistance in their final reflection as well. Some of the concepts mentioned in their quotes that indicate resistance involve asking who is behind the information, what evidence is there to support it, mentioning checking sources, fact-checking, mentioning like recognizing false information, actions that they intend to take to reduce the spread of false information, discussing the idea of thinking critically about what they are consuming in the media, basically indicating that they consume media a bit more critically and thoughtfully and are therefore more resistant to persuasive techniques and false information that they may encounter in the media. The implications of this study indicate that adolescents are vulnerable to persuasion and false information in the media. This is confirmed by Jolly et al., who created the Adolescent Conspiracy Belief Questionnaire and established that adolescents have a higher conspiracy belief rate than any other age group. The implications for educators are that because of this, we need to seek opportunities to incorporate media literacy in all subject areas. Media is embedded in our entire lives, and increasingly so with young people, so therefore we have to use media as educators in order to better inform them in a way that they are more familiar with and more comfortable with and more likely to engage with. The implications for education policymakers is that they need to consider adding media literacy education as a graduation requirement. Given the problems that the spread of false information can cause, it is imperative that we produce citizens that are media literate. And this is not an unreasonable expectation, as financial literacy has been added as a graduation requirement relatively recently in several states, so it is something that can be accomplished. My recommendations for further research and extending this study: 1 would be to develop and utilize an instrument that accurately measures vulnerability to false information. The ACBQ, while it is accurate, it is a measure specifically of belief in conspiracy theories. And that is something that is not apt to change over the span of just 15 weeks. So instead, using an instrument that measures vulnerability and resistance to false information would more accurately reflect the influence of a media literacy education program on that resistance and vulnerability level. 2 would be to use a larger sample size. Having only 13 participants undoubtedly caused the lack of statistical significance in my quantitative data, so using a larger sample size would mitigate that problem. Finally, to measure the influence of media literacy education in a required course. This was utilized in an elective course, and that led to a low participation rate across the board, even for those that did provide qualitative responses. Implementing this in a course that is required might lead to different and more thorough and accurate results. To distribute my findings, I will be presenting at the 2024 Association of Teacher Educators Conference in Anaheim in March. I also intend to provide professional development sessions for other teachers in my school, and eventually would like to do so for the district. And eventually I would like to start a YouTube channel or podcast to distribute my research findings in a method a little bit more palatable to adolescents. And that is my presentation. These are my references. And thank you for listening.